Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I thought I knew everything about him, but then I stumbled upon his secret world. It started innocently. While he was away at work, I sat at his computer, searching for a document I had misplaced. But there it was, on the screen, a message board I didn't recognize. A chat room titled, Furry Cosplay and Roleplay. At first, I thought it was a joke, or maybe a harmless hobby. He had always been into eccentric things, and I never questioned his interests. But something about this seemed off. The message boards were full of colorful animal avatars and cryptic usernames. The messages were odd, discussions about fursuits, different kinds of role-playing, but there was an undertone of something darker, something more secretive. As I dug deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A random click on his computer, and there it was, a forum filled with animal avatars. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had seen similar online communities, people talking about fandoms, hobbies, whatever they were passionate about. But as I scrolled through the threads, something didn't sit right. It wasn't just about costumes or role-playing. It was deeper. There were mentions of hierarchy, training, and obedience. It was as if these people were part of something bigger, something that required total submission and devotion. I was disturbed. My husband was a private man, but I never expected this. I hadn't seen these signs before. Was he part of this community? Was this why he'd been so distant recently? At first, I thought it was just a weird phase. Then I saw the private group messages. It wasn't public anymore. I started finding references to secret chat rooms where the real conversations were happening. The people in these groups weren't just talking about costumes. They were discussing deeper topics, like power dynamics and personal control. I couldn't understand it at first. I scrolled through the private messages and saw my husband's name there, responding in ways that weren't like him. He was always the one in control in our relationship, assertive and confident. But in these messages, he was deferential, submissive. I started to feel nauseous. He was part of this. He was involved in something that was changing him in ways I couldn't even comprehend. His profile had a name I didn't recognize, and I realized he'd been lying to me. Furpup01. That was the username I found on one of the threads. He had used a completely different name for his profile in this world. I felt betrayed. We had always been open about everything, at least I thought we were. I didn't know this part of him. This secret, hidden away in the corner of our lives, had been building for years. The more I looked into it, the more I saw this wasn't just a side hobby. It was a full-fledged community with their own rituals and expectations. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? Why didn't I know about it? And, most importantly, who was he in these secret spaces? Who had he become? The community isn't just about costumes. It's a psychological trap, and he's fallen deep. What I found next made my stomach turn. There were messages between him and other members, some of whom seemed to have far more control over him than I did. There were references to training, to submission. He had been attending secret furry gatherings for years, and I hadn't noticed. These weren't just fun get-togethers. They were deep, intense psychological role-playing sessions where control was handed over to others. There were people with authority in this world, alphas and masters, people who manipulated others, including my husband. The more I read, the clearer it became. These gatherings weren't innocent at all. They were tools of manipulation. My husband wasn't just a participant. He was being molded into something else. He's been attending these secret gatherings for years, and I never knew. Each time he came home from one of these events, he seemed off, distant, cold. I just thought it was a phase, or that he was tired. I never imagined that these gatherings weren't just for fun. They were designed to break him down, to create a dependency on the group and their control. I found a forum thread that detailed the psychological techniques used in these communities. How they isolate you, how they break down your sense of self, how they make you believe that you are only valuable when you submit. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. He was no longer the man I married. He was a different person, one shaped by their influence. The guilt, the shame, the manipulation. It was all so overwhelming. One photo caught my eye, him in a full fursuit, with a stranger's arm around him. I froze. This wasn't just a playful costume, as I had assumed. It was an intimate moment, a bond formed through this world he had kept hidden from me. My husband, in a fur suit, standing next to someone else, someone whose face I couldn't even recognize. There was a connection between them, something deep and almost possessive. The person's arm was draped around him like they were lovers. I felt a surge of panic. My mind raced. Was this what he had been doing behind my back? Was he more involved in this lifestyle than I ever realized? The thought twisted in my stomach. How long had he been lying to me, and what had he gotten himself into? I confronted him once, but he denied everything, and I believed him. Until now. The day I asked him about the forum, his reaction was defensive. He swore it was nothing, just a harmless online community where people talked about costumes. He seemed genuinely confused when I questioned him, and for a moment, I almost believed him. But now, knowing what I knew, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was going on. I had to know more. I had to uncover the truth. I couldn't let him keep living in this lie, especially not if it meant losing him forever. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something else: fear. Fear of being caught, fear of being exposed. I wasn't sure who he was anymore. The messages, the meetups, the hidden online life. It all felt like I was losing him. The deeper I dug into his secret life, the more I realized how much I had missed. He had been hiding things from me for years, things that went beyond harmless interests. These furry gatherings weren't just about dressing up in animal costumes and playing pretend. They were about power and control, about manipulating people into roles they didn't even realize they had accepted. I saw his messages with other members, some of whom called themselves masters, others mentors. These were the people who had shaped his identity. The man I married seemed to be slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. He was becoming someone else, someone I didn't recognize. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else controlled him in ways I couldn't understand. The more I looked at the messages, the more I realized that my husband wasn't just participating in this community. He was being manipulated by someone with more power. There was a leader in this world, someone who seemed to have a magnetic influence over him. The others called him Alpha or Master, but my husband called him Sir. That word echoed in my head, unsettling me in a way I hadn't expected. It was as if my husband had given himself over to someone else, and I wasn't sure if I could ever take him back. Was this still the man I loved, or had he been replaced by someone I couldn't recognize? I needed answers, but the deeper I went, the darker it became. My husband's personality was changing. He was colder, more distant. He no longer seemed like the man who used to laugh at my jokes or whisper sweet things in my ear. I noticed the small shifts first. He would spend longer hours on his phone, his eyes avoiding mine when I spoke to him. He started making excuses to go to these meetings, telling me it was a work thing or that he needed time for himself. I didn't ask questions at first, but now I understood why he was pulling away. The psychological grip of this community was far deeper than I could have imagined. I couldn't help but wonder, had he been living a double life all this time, or had I missed the signs all along? It was as if I had been blind to the person he had become. There was one man who seemed to have the most influence over him, a leader. The more I read through the messages, the more I realized how central this man was to my husband's life. He called himself Master Fur in the forums, and his influence over my husband was undeniable. They talked regularly, and the things they discussed were disturbing. My husband referred to him with such reverence, as if he had no will of his own. Master Fur had a way of making my husband feel special, important, but only when he followed the rules, when he obeyed. It was psychological manipulation, but it felt so much deeper than that. This wasn't just roleplay. It was control, complete, total control. I couldn't understand how my husband had become so attached to him, but there it was. A part of him had been lost to this man, and I wasn't sure if I could get him back. He called him Master in private messages. I was paralyzed by that. Seeing those words, hearing my husband refer to another man as Master, it shattered something deep inside me. I always thought of us as equals, partners in everything. But this was different. It wasn't just some weird hobby anymore. It was real. And the person who had the most control over him wasn't me. It was this Master Fur. I felt a surge of anger, confusion, and a sense of betrayal that I couldn't describe. How had we ended up here? Had I been so blind, so oblivious to what was really going on in his life? Or had he changed so much that I didn't even recognize him anymore? The thought of him submitting to someone else made me feel like I was losing him piece by piece. He's been attending these secret gatherings for years, and I hadn't known. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep this rabbit hole went. These weren't just casual meetups. They were events that reinforced the power dynamics, that taught the attendees to submit, to follow rules without question. I dug through old chat logs, finding pictures of these gatherings. My husband in his full fur suit, surrounded by others, all wearing the same expressions of devotion, of submission. They were a family, but not the kind of family I had imagined for us. It wasn't love. It wasn't mutual respect. It was control. A group of people who knew exactly how to prey on my husband's insecurities, and they had taken advantage of him. How had I missed it? How had he gotten this deep into their world without me noticing? I couldn't help but wonder, had he been living a double life all this time? The thought haunted me every time I looked at him. He was still my husband in so many ways, but he was also someone else now, a person shaped by the influence of this furry world and the people who controlled him. I couldn't even get a straight answer from him anymore. Every time I tried to talk to him about it, he would deflect or shut down. He didn't want to acknowledge the truth, and part of me wasn't sure he could. He had been so thoroughly immersed in this community that it felt like I was talking to a stranger when I spoke to him. This wasn't the person I had married. This wasn't the man who had vowed to love and cherish me. This was someone different, and I didn't know how to bring him back. His need to escape into this furry world became more urgent. What was he running from? I couldn't understand. Was he running from me? From the responsibilities of our life together? Or was he running from himself? It felt like every time we were together, he was thinking about them, the community. It was as if he wasn't fully present. His mind was elsewhere. It terrified me to think that the man I had married was disappearing into this world, leaving me behind. But the more I searched, the more I learned about these gatherings, the more I realized that they weren't just about costumes. They were a place for people to escape, to hide from their realities. Maybe he didn't know how to face the truth anymore. Maybe he was afraid of who he was becoming. But that didn't stop the pain of seeing him slip away from me. I found old chat logs, talk of submission, control, and emotional manipulation. As I dug deeper into his messages, I uncovered the patterns of behavior that had been slowly breaking him down. The people in these groups weren't just talking about role-playing. They were talking about submission, obedience, and dominance. My husband had become a tool for their control, and I could see it in the way he spoke about them. Respect, fear, admiration, all tangled into one. He had been groomed, trained. The emotional manipulation was obvious now, though I hadn't seen it at first. They had used his insecurities against him, made him feel special, but only as long as he obeyed. They had made him believe that without them, he was nothing. I couldn't bear to think about it. I couldn't bear to see him like this, but what could I do? How could I break him free from their hold? I had tried to talk to him, to make him see how deep he was sinking, but every time I tried, he pulled away further. It was as if he couldn't hear me anymore. He would get defensive, then distant. It hurt more than I could ever express. This man, the one I married, the one who once confided in me, was slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't catch him. The more I pressed, the more he retreated into this world. His messages with Master Fur became more frequent, more intimate. I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him, not just emotionally, but mentally. His mind was consumed by this secret life. It felt like every time he returned from one of these gatherings, he was a little more detached from me, a little more distant. I wanted to scream, to shake him awake, but I knew it wouldn't help. He wasn't the same person anymore. I thought I could handle it. I really did. But the moment I realized that this community wasn't just some strange hobby, it was an addiction, a psychological game, I felt powerless. I couldn't make him see that this was breaking us apart. It was like trying to wake someone up from a dream they didn't want to leave. I watched him transform, physically and emotionally. The confident man I had married had become someone unsure, submissive, almost childlike. He no longer had the drive to do the things we once enjoyed together. The hobbies, the conversations, the future plans. Everything felt meaningless to him now. He was consumed by this alternate reality, a world of fursuits, hierarchies, and control. I had become the outsider in my own marriage, and I didn't know if there was anything I could do to get him back. It wasn't just the costumes. It was the role play, the submission, the need to belong to something more powerful. As I kept reading through the private messages, I realized the extent of the control this alpha had over him. It was more than just a simple power exchange. It was a full-on psychological manipulation. My husband, once a strong, independent man, had been broken down piece by piece. The alpha had become his everything, his identity, his purpose. He called him sir in every conversation, followed orders without question. There was no room for me in his life anymore. He had become a shell of the man I loved, and as I looked at the evidence of his submission, I felt both disgusted and heartbroken. How had this happened? And why was I the last to know? The decision weighed heavily on me. Should I confront him, or should I walk away? My heart ached as I thought about all the years we had spent together. We had built a life together, a future. But now that future seemed impossible to reach. I couldn't even talk to him without feeling like I was speaking to a stranger. He wasn't the man I married. He was someone else, someone twisted by this world he had immersed himself in. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he just needed help. Maybe I could bring him back. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if it was too late. Could I really save him from this community? Or was I just a bystander to a transformation I couldn't stop? I knew what I had to do, but I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to do it. I stood in front of him one night, shaking with fear and rage. I had to ask the question, had he fallen so deeply into this world that he couldn't see what it was doing to him? His face was blank when I asked him if he was still the man I married. He didn't answer right away. The silence between us was suffocating. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the man he once was and the man he had become. Finally, he spoke, but the words were hollow, distant. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. Those words cut through me like a knife. The man I loved was lost, and I wasn't sure if I could bring him back. The weight of that realization crushed me. I tried to convince him to leave the community. I begged him to break free from their grip, to come back to me. But his response was always the same. "They're my family now." The words burned like acid in my chest. Family? These strangers, these people who had broken him down, made him feel less than human, were his family? The thought consumed me. He didn't see what I saw. He didn't understand that this wasn't love. This was control. This was manipulation. But he couldn't see it, and I didn't know how to make him see. I felt helpless, trapped in a marriage that no longer felt real. The more I tried to pull him out of it, the more he resisted. It was like fighting a battle I couldn't win. The days turned into weeks, and I could feel the distance between us grow. I watched him slip further into this world, further away from the person I had married. The pain was unbearable. I wanted to scream at him, to force him to snap out of it, but I knew that wouldn't work. He had already given so much of himself to them. He wasn't the same man anymore. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting the community. I was fighting his own mind. He had been so thoroughly brainwashed by the messages, the rituals, the constant reinforcement of obedience and submission, that he didn't even recognize how much control they had over him. He thought he was free, but he wasn't. He was trapped in a psychological prison, and I couldn't figure out how to break him free. I made the hardest decision of my life that day. I could feel my heart breaking as I spoke the words, but I knew I had no choice. "I can't do this anymore," I said. His face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "I love you," I said, but the words felt hollow, empty. "But I can't love this person you've become." He looked at me like I had just slapped him, like I had taken away the last piece of stability he had. And maybe I had. But I realized something then. He wasn't going to change for me. He wasn't going to come back to me. He had already made his choice. And no matter how much I loved him, I couldn't save him from himself. I spent the next few days in a fog, caught between grief and relief. It was like waking up from a nightmare and realizing it was too late to go back. The thought of leaving him, of walking away from everything we had built, was unbearable. But I had to face the truth. He wasn't the person I married anymore, and I couldn't be part of this world he had chosen. His response was everything I feared. Anger, confusion, then resignation. He didn't fight me. It was like he had already mentally checked out of our marriage long before I ever found out. But that didn't make it any easier. I still loved him, but I couldn't love the shell of a man he had become. Every time I thought about him, I felt a pit in my stomach. But I had to let go. It was the only way forward. Leaving him felt like tearing a part of myself away. The life we shared, the memories, the moments we had built together. How could I just throw it all away? But as I stood in our empty apartment, I knew I had to. He wasn't going to change, not for me, not for anyone. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he even wanted to change. The power these people had over him was too strong, too deep. I couldn't fix him, no matter how much I loved him. The man I had married had slipped away into a world of fantasy, and I was left behind, watching helplessly as he faded further into it. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies and control. The day I left him was the hardest day of my life. As I packed up my things, I could feel his eyes on me, but there was nothing left to say. He didn't try to stop me. It was like he had already accepted that I was slipping away from him. When I walked out the door for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. The pain was overwhelming, but there was a strange sense of freedom in that moment too. I wasn't trapped anymore. I wasn't bound by the lies, by the manipulation. But I still had questions. Was there a way to reach him? Was there a way to save him from this world that had taken him so completely? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I had to move forward. I couldn't waste my life on a marriage that had already been consumed by darkness. Months passed, and I tried to move on. But the memories of him haunted me. I couldn't forget the man I once loved, the man who had been stolen away from me by this community. I heard through mutual friends that he was still attending the gatherings, still submitting to Master Fur, still trapped. It broke my heart every time I heard about him. He had been lost to me, to this world, and I didn't know if he would ever find his way back. I tried not to think about him, but it was impossible. The love I had for him wasn't something I could just turn off. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he even wanted to escape anymore. He had become a different person, someone I didn't recognize. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be saved. One evening, I received a message from him. My heart skipped a beat as I read the words. I miss you. The message was simple, but it carried so much weight. I hadn't heard from him in months, and now he was reaching out. Part of me wanted to rush back to him, to hold him and make everything right again. But then the reality hit me. The man I loved was still in that world, still controlled by the people who had twisted him. Could I really go back to that? Could I ever trust him again? The message left me with more questions than answers. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not unless he was willing to fight for himself. Not unless he was willing to fight for us. I decided to meet him. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but I needed closure. I needed to see if there was any part of the man I married still left inside him. We met at a small cafe, and when I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked different, distant, as though a piece of him was missing. But when he spoke, his voice trembled with something I couldn't place. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes full of regret. "I've lost myself, and I don't know how to find my way back." My heart broke for him. He was still the man I loved in so many ways, but he was also someone else, someone who had been so deeply affected by this world that I wasn't sure if he could come back. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I knew better. "I can't help you," I said softly. "You have to help yourself." The tears welled up in his eyes, but I didn't stay. I couldn't. The person he had become was not someone I could save. Not anymore. I never saw him again after that day. I think he knew that he couldn't be the man I needed him to be. The man I loved. I think, deep down, he knew that I had already let go, that I had already made peace with the fact that he was lost to me. The months turned into years, and though I tried to move on, I carried a piece of him with me. The memories, the love we once shared, the life we built. It was all part of me, but it was also a part of my past that I couldn't revisit. I learned that sometimes love isn't enough to save someone from themselves. Sometimes, people have to choose to save themselves. And sometimes, you have to let them go. I don't know what happened to him after that. I heard rumors that he eventually left the community, but by then, it was too late for us. I don't know if he ever fully escaped their grip, or if he was able to find himself again. I only know that I had to move on. The pain never fully went away, but I learned to live with it. Life moved forward, and so did I. I couldn't keep looking back, couldn't keep hoping that he would return to the person I once knew. I had to accept that some things, some people, are just lost, and no amount of love can bring them back. Years passed, but I never truly forgot him. I tried to, of course. I threw myself into my work, my hobbies, my new relationships. But there were nights, quiet nights when the world was still, when memories of him would come flooding back. I would think about his laugh, the way his eyes would light up when he was excited, the small, tender gestures that once made me feel loved. I even found myself wondering if he ever thought about me, or if I was just a distant memory to him now. It was hard not to wonder where he was, what kind of life he was leading, and if he had ever found the peace he so desperately needed. But I had learned not to dwell in the past. The past was a place I couldn't return to, and as much as I still cared for him, I knew that my future couldn't be built on the remains of a broken relationship. One afternoon, out of nowhere, I got a letter. I hadn't heard from him in years, and suddenly this letter appeared. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. It was a simple letter, no grand declarations, but the words were powerful. He apologized for everything, for the lies, the deceit, the hurt he caused. He told me he had finally left the furry community, that he had spent years trying to understand what had happened to him, trying to find himself again. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't expect me to take him back, but he wanted me to know that he had changed, that he was no longer the man I had walked away from. The letter ended with a plea for me to forgive him, to let go of the past, and to live my life without regret. The words felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but they also left me torn. Could I forgive him? Could I even trust him again after everything that had happened? I sat with that letter for days, turning the words over in my mind. Part of me wanted to forgive him. I wanted to believe that he had truly changed, that the man who had once loved me was still inside him. But another part of me was terrified. What if this was just another lie, another trick to draw me back into his world? What if he hadn't really changed at all, but had just found a new way to manipulate me? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was clear. I had come so far in my own life. I had built a life that was mine, a life that didn't revolve around him or the chaos he had brought into our world. I couldn't just let that go because of a letter. Still, part of me wondered what would have happened if we had had the chance to try again. But I also knew that I couldn't live my life in the shadow of what-ifs. My future was waiting, and I had to keep moving forward. After reading the letter over and over again, I made the decision not to reach out to him. I couldn't. Not because I didn't still care, but because I had already given him my heart once, and I wasn't willing to risk it again. I had learned too much, seen too much to go back to that place. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me. It was about my own healing, my own growth. I didn't want to spend my life trying to fix someone else's brokenness. I had to let go, truly let go. As painful as it was the right choice. The man he had been was not the man I could love. The man he had become was someone I no longer recognized. I had no place in that life anymore, and neither did he in mine. With him, I can't help but wonder if there was ever a point where we could have turned things around. But then I remind myself that the past is a place I can't revisit. What's more important now is the future, the life I'm building for myself. The man I loved is no longer part of that future, and I've made peace with that. I've let go of the guilt, the anger, the confusion. I've accepted that he had his own journey to take, and I had mine. We were two different people, and we always will be. And that's okay. Sometimes, love just isn't enough to keep two people together, no matter how hard you try. Time has a way of healing wounds, even the deepest ones. I learned that the hard way. It wasn't easy. There were days when I wondered if I had made the right choice, days when I wished things could have turned out differently. But as the years passed, I began to see that I had done the right thing. I had found my own strength, my own independence. I had built a life that was mine, one that wasn't defined by the chaos of a broken marriage or the scars of a past I couldn't change. I found happiness in small things: the love of good friends, the satisfaction of a job well done, the joy of living for myself. I had found peace, and I was finally free. Every now and then, I would think of him. I would wonder where he was, what he was doing, if he had truly found the peace he was looking for. But those thoughts were fleeting. I realized that the love I had for him was not the same anymore. It wasn't the burning passion it once was, but a quiet understanding that he had been part of my life, and I had been part of his. And in that quiet space, I had found a way to let go. I had learned that sometimes love doesn't mean staying. Sometimes it means walking away to save yourself. And that was the hardest lesson I had to learn, but it was also the one that set me free. One day, I received a message from a mutual friend. They told me that my ex-husband had remarried. He had found someone else to love, someone who didn't carry the baggage of his past. The news hit me harder than I expected. I thought I had moved on, but in that moment, I realized I hadn't fully let go. I was happy for him. I truly was. He had found a new chapter in his life, and that was something I had always wanted for him. But I couldn't help the ache that settled in my chest. It was as though a part of me had never fully been able to accept the end of our story. But I pushed the feeling aside. I had my own life to live now, and I couldn't let the past hold me back anymore. I've learned to embrace the uncertainty of life. We never know where the path will lead us, but we have to trust that each step we take is leading us somewhere important. Looking back, I don't regret the love I gave him. I don't regret the life we shared. It was real, even if it didn't last. It was a chapter in my story, one that helped shape who I am today. But now, my story continues without him. And that's okay. I am stronger now, wiser, and more determined than ever to live my truth. Whatever the future holds, I know that I can handle it. And that, to me, is enough. Years have passed since I walked away from him, and though I've had my share of good days and bad days, I've finally found a peace I never thought possible. I spent a long time wondering if there was something more I could have done, if there was a chance I could have saved him, but the truth is, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I used to think I had failed him by leaving, but now, I realize that the only failure would have been staying, allowing myself to be consumed by someone else's darkness. I had to let go, not just of him, but of the idea that I was responsible for his happiness. He had his own path to follow, and I had mine. The hardest thing I ever did was walk away, but it was also the best thing I could have done. For both of us, sometimes I think about how different things could have been. What if he hadn't gotten involved in that world? What if I had been able to help him earlier? But then I remind myself that those questions don't matter anymore. They're part of a life I no longer lead. The woman I am now is stronger, more self-assured and free. I've built a life that is mine, no longer defined by the mistakes and betrayals of the past. I've traveled, met new people, found hobbies I never imagined I'd love, and learned to love myself again. The woman I used to be, the one who was so deeply enmeshed in that toxic relationship, is a distant memory. I'm proud of who I've become. One of the hardest things about leaving him was the fear that I would never truly be happy again. I had loved him with every part of me, and I thought that love would be enough to make it work. But love, as I learned, isn't always enough. Sometimes it's not about how much you love someone. It's about how much you love yourself. The love I gave him, the sacrifices I made for him, it all seemed to fade into the background once I started focusing on myself. And though the road to self-love wasn't always easy, it was the most rewarding journey I've ever been on. I've discovered things about myself I never knew existed, and I've found happiness that doesn't rely on anyone else. It was the greatest gift I could have given myself. Despite everything, I can't help but feel a sense of sadness for what could have been. There was a time when I truly believed in the fairy tale, the happy ending. But reality is far messier than any storybook. People change, sometimes in ways we can't understand. I spent so long holding on to the man I thought he was, the man I loved, that I never stopped to truly see who he had become. When I finally let go, it felt like I was releasing not just him, but all the dreams I had for our future. I had to mourn that loss, and for the first time, I allowed myself to grieve the life I thought we'd have. But grieving is a part of healing, and as time passed, I learned that letting go didn't mean I had to forget. It just meant I had to accept that chapter was over. I've learned so much about trust, both in others and in myself. For a long time, I questioned my own judgment, wondering how I could have missed the signs, how I could have been so blind to the reality of his life. But now, I know that I did the best I could with what I had. Sometimes we don't see the truth until we're ready, until we're strong enough to face it. I've learned to trust my instincts, to trust my heart, and most importantly, to trust that I will always be okay, no matter what life throws my way. I've survived things I never thought I could, and that strength has become a part of me. I no longer fear the unknown. I embrace it. Looking back at my relationship, as the years go on, I realize how much I've changed. I'm no longer that woman who felt lost and broken after the betrayal. I've grown stronger, wiser, more resilient. I've learned that the most important relationship in life is the one you have with yourself. When I finally stopped looking for validation outside of me, I found something beautiful within. I found the ability to love myself unconditionally, to forgive myself for the mistakes I made, and to embrace the woman I've become. There's no greater peace than that. And for the first time in a long time, I feel whole. I'm not waiting for someone else to fix me, to make me feel complete. I am complete, just as I am. I think about what I've learned through this entire experience, and I realize that it wasn't just about him or the lies he told. It was about me. It was about learning who I am outside of the confines of a relationship, of learning what I need and deserve in my life. I no longer see myself as a victim of his choices. I see myself as a survivor, someone who came out the other side stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. I've learned that love is not about control or manipulation. It's about respect, trust, and freedom. The love I once gave him was real, but it wasn't enough to save either of us. The love I give myself now is more powerful than any love I could give another person. Sometimes I wonder if he's ever thought about me, if he ever regrets what happened between us. But then I remind myself that I can't control his thoughts or his feelings. He's on his own journey now, just as I am on mine. And while I can never forget the pain, the betrayal, the confusion, I've learned to let go. I've learned that the greatest gift I can give myself is the freedom to live my life without the weight of the past holding me back. I've forgiven him, but more importantly, I've forgiven myself. And in that forgiveness, I've found peace. It's been a while now, but I find myself still surprised by the way life unfolds. There are moments when I catch myself thinking about the past, the man I once loved, the life we shared. But those thoughts no longer sting like they used to. I've learned that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about accepting it. I've come to understand that the person I am today is not defined by the pain I've endured, but by how I've chosen to rise above it. I've built a life that is mine, and every step I've taken since then has been one of strength and resilience. I am proud of who I've become, and I wouldn't trade the lessons I've learned for anything. Sometimes, when I see couples in love, I wonder what it would have been like if things had turned out differently. What if we hadn't fallen apart? What if we had been able to face the challenges together instead of letting them tear us apart? But then I remember that the life I have now is so much more than I ever thought possible. I'm not waiting for someone else to complete me. I've learned to be whole on my own. I've realized that real love isn't about finding someone to fill the emptiness inside of you. It's about sharing your whole, complete self with someone else. And while I'm not in a relationship right now, I know that I'm open to the possibility when the time is right. But I won't settle. I've learned what I deserve, and I won't accept anything less. One thing I never expected was how much my past would shape my future. I never imagined that walking away from him would be the thing that ultimately set me free. But it did. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but looking back, it was the best one. I've discovered things about myself that I never knew existed. I've learned to trust my instincts, to make decisions based on what's best for me, not anyone else. I no longer feel the weight of someone else's expectations. I am free to live my life on my terms, and that is the most liberating feeling in the world. I've also realized how important it is to let go of the guilt that comes with leaving someone you loved. I used to carry that guilt around like a heavy weight, convinced that I was abandoning him when he needed me the most. But now I see it differently. By walking away, I gave him the space he needed to find his own path. I didn't enable his behavior by staying. I gave him the freedom to face his own demons, just as I had to face mine. And in doing so, I freed myself from the toxic cycle we were trapped in. It wasn't an act of abandonment, it was an act of love. And I finally understand that. It's strange how life comes full circle sometimes. The pain, the heartache, the confusion. I can look at it now and see it all as part of my journey. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had to go through all of that to become the person I am today. I had to face my fears, confront my weaknesses, and accept my own role in the relationship. It wasn't just him who made mistakes. It was both of us. We were both lost in our own ways. But I've learned that growth isn't about blaming someone else. It's about looking at yourself and saying, I am responsible for my own happiness. And that's something I never truly understood until now. I've learned to forgive, not just him, but myself too. I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting, but now I know that forgiveness is about releasing the hold the past has on you. It's about letting go of the anger, the hurt, the resentment. Forgiveness doesn't mean what happened is okay. It just means you're ready to move on. And I've finally reached that point. I've let go of the anger I once held towards him, the bitterness that clouded my judgment. And in doing so, I've found peace. I've found peace in knowing that I did the best I could with what I had at the time, and I've made peace with the fact that things didn't turn out the way I had hoped. Every so often, I wonder what he's doing now, how his life turned out. I wonder if he's found the peace he was searching for, if he's healed from the darkness that consumed him. But I also realize that I can't focus on him anymore. I can't spend my life wondering about someone else's journey. My journey is my own. And while I will always carry the memories of our time together, I no longer let them dictate my future. I've learned to let go of what no longer serves me, to focus on the present and the future, and to trust that the right things will come when the time is right. I've learned that healing isn't linear. There are days when it feels like nothing has changed, and then there are days when everything clicks into place. And I've learned to be patient with myself on those tough days. Healing takes time, and it's okay to have setbacks. But I've also learned that no setback is permanent. Every step I take, no matter how small, brings me closer to the person I want to be. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the progress I've made, proud of the strength I've found in myself. I've become someone I admire, and that's something I never thought I'd say. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? There are times when I feel like I've finally figured things out, and then something unexpected happens. But I've learned to embrace the uncertainty. I've learned that nothing in life is guaranteed, and that's okay. It's the unpredictability that makes life so beautiful. I've learned to take risks, to try new things, to step outside my comfort zone. I've learned that the more you embrace the unknown, the more you discover about yourself. And that's the most incredible journey of all, the journey of self-discovery. So here I am, telling you this story. The story of a woman who was once lost, but who found her way through the darkness. The story of a woman who learned to trust herself, to let go of the past, and to embrace the future. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know that whatever it is, I am ready. Because I've learned the most important lesson of all, that I am enough. I don't need anyone else to complete me. I am whole, just as I am. And with that knowledge, I can face anything the world throws my way. So this is where my story ends, and where my new beginning begins,